Picture a family that ruled the richest kingdom in Europe, that built the largest palace the continent had ever seen, that commanded the loyalty of 28 million people. Now picture that same family locked in a cold stone tower, drinking watered wine and eating stale bread, while outside a crowd builds a machine designed to remove their heads. That happened. But here's what almost nobody realizes. The guillotine wasn't the end of this story. It was the halfway point. Because 200 years after the French Revolution supposedly erased the House of Bourbon from history, there are still 3 men alive today, in 3 different countries, who quietly believe the crown of France belongs to them. To understand how a dynasty survives its own execution, you have to go back to the version of this family, before any of it happened, before the tower, before the trial, before the child who would die alone in the dark. By the late 1780s, the Bourbons had ruled France for close to 200 years. Versailles was theirs. A colonial empire stretching from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean was theirs. At the head of it sat King Louis XVI and his Austrian-born wife, Marie Antoinette, along with their children. Their oldest child was a daughter, Marie-Thérèse, born in 1778. Then came a son, Louis Joseph, born in 1781, and given the title Dauphin, heir to the throne. Then Louis Charles, born in 1785. A fourth child, a daughter named Sophie, died as an infant. Louis Joseph, the boy who was supposed to inherit France, was sick almost from birth, his spine slowly curving under what doctors believed was a form of tuberculosis. And here is where the story's first real turn happens, quietly, almost unnoticed at the time. Louis Joseph died on the 4th of June, 1789, just 5 weeks before the storming of the Bastille. Barely anyone mourned him. Bread prices tripled. The treasury empty. People were too hungry to grieve a prince they'd never see rule. So the throne, still decades away in theory, passed instead to a 4-year-old boy who had no idea what was coming, Louis Charles. At first, the revolution didn't demand blood. Moderates wanted a constitutional monarchy, something closer to what Britain already had. And for a while, that looked achievable. Louis XVI wasn't a tyrant. He was indecisive, easily swayed, more interested in locksmithing than governing, but not cruel. Marie Antoinette was a different problem entirely. She pushed her husband toward resistance and wrote secretly to her brother, the Holy Roman Emperor, asking for military help. To the revolutionaries, she became the enemy inside the palace, mocked as Madame Deficit, accused of bankrupting the nation while children starved. In October 1789, that resentment turned physical. A crowd of Parisian market women, several thousand strong, marched to Versailles, broke into the grounds, and killed 2 of the Queen's guards before she escaped through a private passage. By the next morning, the mob forced the entire royal family back to Paris, into the Tuileries Palace. They were still called King and Queen. But they were prisoners now, watched constantly, their letters opened, their household staff cut down to almost nothing. For nearly 2 years they lived like that, a strange suspended half-captivity. And then, on the night of the 20th of June, 1791, they tried to escape. The plan was to reach royalist troops near the eastern border and rally a counter-revolution from there. It was a plan built on hope rather than competence. The family traveled in a heavy, conspicuous carriage. They moved too slowly and stopped too often. At the town of Saint-Emilion, a local official recognized the king. Some accounts say from his resemblance to the printed image on French currency, though the details of the encounter are disputed. What isn't disputed is what happened next. The family was intercepted at Varennes, roughly 30 miles from the border, and marched back to Paris in humiliation. The escape attempt itself did damage. But what really broke the country's remaining trust in Louis was a document he left behind, a memorandum in which he denounced the revolution outright and admitted that every concession he'd made so far had been forced, not genuine. He'd been playing along. Now everyone knew it. Within weeks, royal symbols were being torn down from shops and taverns across Paris. And for the first time, ordinary people began openly discussing something that had been unthinkable a year earlier: a republic with no king at all. Louis clung to the fiction of constitutional monarchy for another year. What was he actually holding on to by that point? A throne, or just the appearance of one? It didn't survive the summer of 1792. Austria and Prussia declared war on revolutionary France, and the Austrian commander threatened to destroy Paris if the royal family was harmed, a threat that backfired instantly, since it seemed to confirm exactly what revolutionaries already suspected: that the king was in league with foreign armies against his own people. On the 10th of August 1792, a mob stormed the Tuileries. The king's Swiss Guard, his last real line of defense, was slaughtered almost to the last man. The family fled into the nearby Legislative Assembly and begged for shelter among the very lawmakers debating whether to abolish the throne beneath them. Weeks later, the monarchy was gone. France, a republic. The family was moved to the Temple, a 500-year-old fortress that had once belonged to the Knights Templar. For a household raised in gilded rooms the size of city blocks, it must have felt like being buried alive. And yet, for a few months, something almost domestic held together inside those walls. Breakfast at 9. Afternoon lessons for the boy. His mother and his aunt, Princess Elizabeth, sewing and reading in the evenings. It was a performance of ordinary family life, staged inside a cage, and it wouldn't last. Outside those walls, the country around them was changing faster than the family inside the temple could have known. More than 100,000 nobles, clergy, and officers had already fled France by this point, scattering to London, Vienna, and Turin, rather than wait and see what the new order had planned for them. Those who stayed and were caught faced a revolutionary tribunal within a year, would be executing people at a pace no one in Europe had ever witnessed from a supposedly civilized government. In December 1792, Louis was put on trial before the National Convention, accused of dozens of separate charges of conspiracy and treason. The vote on his guilt was almost unanimous. The vote on his punishment was not. Deputies argued for more than a day straight over whether death was really necessary, whether exile or imprisonment might serve the same purpose without turning a deposed king into a martyr. In the end, out of 721 deputies, the death penalty passed by a margin of exactly the number needed for a bare majority: 361 votes. One seat's worth of hesitation in either direction, and the entire next century of French history might have looked completely different. On the 21st of January, 1793, Louis XVI was driven through Paris under armed guard and executed at what is now the Place de la Concorde. Witnesses say he tried to speak to the crowd, to declare his innocence and forgive his executioners, before drums were ordered to drown him out. He was 38 years old, the only reigning French king ever formally tried and put to death by his own people. Here's where the story does something strange. Under royalist law, the crown passed instantly and automatically to the eldest surviving son, which meant that the moment the blade fell, an 8-year-old boy sitting in a prison cell became King Louis XVII of France, recognized as such by royalist courts across Europe. He never ruled a single day. He never left his cell. But for the men plotting his family's return, this small, frightened child was now the entire cause. What happened to him next is one of the darkest threads in this whole story, and it starts with a decision that, on its own, looked almost bureaucratic. In July 1793, guards separated Louis Charles from his mother. Accounts describe her clinging to the boy and having to be physically pulled away. She never saw her son again. He was placed in the custody of a cobbler turned revolutionary named Antoine Simon, whose job was explicit: turn the boy into a loyal citizen of the Republic and strip away everything royal about him. What followed was months of documented abuse. Simon reportedly had the child drink alcohol, sing revolutionary songs, and denounce his own parents. And then came something even worse. Simon pressured the traumatized 8-year-old into signing a statement making horrifying, false claims against his own mother. That fabricated statement was then used as evidence when Marie Antoinette herself was put on trial that October. Her trial was, even by revolutionary standards, extraordinary. She was accused of draining the treasury to enrich Austria, of plotting against the Republic, and using her own son's coerced words against her, of the abuse Simon had forced the boy to describe. When that accusation was read aloud in court, witnesses say she broke her composure for the only time during the entire trial, turning to the women in the public gallery and appealing to them, as mothers, to judge for themselves whether such a thing was even conceivable. It's said the room went silent. It didn't change the verdict. On the 16th of October, 1793, Marie Antoinette was executed. She was 37. Her hair, according to multiple contemporary accounts, had turned completely white during her imprisonment. Her sister-in-law, Princess Elizabeth, followed her to the scaffold the following spring, in May 1794. She'd had chances to flee France in the years before and refused every one of them, choosing to stay with her brother's children instead. She was 30 years old, and with her death, there was no adult member of the immediate royal family left alive inside France. And the family was never the exception here. That's the part that's easy to miss if you only remember this period as the story of a fallen queen. Historians estimate roughly 17,000 people were officially executed during the 9 or so months of the Terror alone, and the popular image of aristocrats filling the tumbrils is mostly wrong. Studies of the execution records suggest something closer to 85% of those killed were ordinary commoners, laborers, shopkeepers, servants, caught up in a machine built on suspicion, denunciation, and a single careless word to the wrong neighbor. The royal family wasn't destroyed because they were uniquely hated. They were destroyed because they were the most visible face of a system that, by then, was devouring almost everyone who touched it. That left 2 children in the temple, Marie-Thérèse, now 19, and Louis Charles, still not yet 9. And this is where the story goes quiet in the worst possible way. After Simon was removed from his post, the boy was essentially abandoned, locked in a room, largely unattended, for what may have been as long as 6 months. He developed tuberculosis and skin infections from neglect. When officials finally checked on him again in 1795, they found a child who could barely speak or stand. On the 8th of June, 1795, Louis Charles died in his cell. He was 10 years old. Here's the detail that makes this story stretch 2 more centuries past that room. The doctor who performed the autopsy secretly removed the boy's heart and preserved it. That heart then traveled, smuggled, stolen, passed hand to hand across royal families in Spain, Austria, and Portugal. For more than 200 years, while dozens of impostors across Europe spent the 19th century claiming they were actually the lost Dauphin, secretly smuggled out alive. Every one of them was eventually proven false. In the year 2000, scientists finally tested the heart's DNA against a preserved lock of Marie Antoinette's hair. It matched. In 2004, 209 years after his death, the heart of Louis XVII was formally buried in the royal crypt at Saint Denis, finally laid beside his parents. His sister survived, but only barely. Marie-Thérèse spent more than 3 years essentially alone in the temple, told almost nothing about her family's fate. She didn't learn her mother had been executed until long afterward. She had no idea her younger brother had died in a room above her own cell. In December 1795, she was finally released, not out of mercy, but as part of a prisoner exchange with Austria, traded for French officials held across the border. She arrived in Vienna at 17 years old, having lost her father, her mother, her brother, and her aunt, all within about 2.5 years. And here the dynasty could have simply ended. It didn't. Because Louis XVI had 2 younger brothers, and while their family was being imprisoned and executed, both of them had already escaped the country. The Comte d'Artois left France almost immediately, within days of the storming of the Bastille in 1789. His older brother, the Comte de Provence, stayed behind far longer, quietly building his own escape. And on the very same night as the ill-fated flight to Varennes in June 1791, He made his own attempt using a different route, and succeeded where his brother, the king, had failed. From exile, the Comte de Provence began calling himself Louis XVIII, insisting his nephew's death in 1795 had made him the rightful king. He would spend the next 23 years waiting the terror. Waiting through the rise of a Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, who would crown himself emperor and reorganize the legal and administrative structure of the entire country. Waiting through wars that reshaped the map of Europe twice over. He was overweight, afflicted with gout, and physically unimposing, but he had something none of the rest of his family had shown: patience and the political sense to know the old world wasn't coming back intact. That patience paid off in 1814, when a coalition of European powers finally defeated Napoleon, exiled him to the island of Elba. The Allies made a calculated decision: restore the Bourbons. Louis XVIII returned to a France he barely recognized after 25 years away, a country with Napoleon's law code, Napoleon's administrators, an entire generation that had grown up knowing nothing but revolution and empire. To his credit, he didn't try to erase all of it. He issued a charter guaranteeing civil liberties and kept a two-chamber legislature. He pardoned most of the revolutionaries, but the hardline royalists who'd returned with him, the so-called ultras, wanted revenge, not compromise, and they never stopped pushing him for more. Then, in March 1815, came the twist almost nobody in Europe saw coming. While the great powers were still in Vienna redrawing the map of the continent, Napoleon slipped off Elba, landed near Cannes on the French coast with roughly 1,000 loyal men, and started walking north. What happened next is one of the strangest military collapses in European history. The regiments sent to stop him didn't fight him. They joined him, one after another, all the way to Paris. Even Marshal Ney, who had personally promised Louis he'd bring Napoleon back to the capital in an iron cage, instead knelt in front of his old emperor and pledged his sword to him again. Louis fled the capital in the night. Napoleon walked back into the Tuileries without a single shot fired. It lasted exactly 110 days. Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in June 1815 ended it for good, and Louis returned to the throne for a second time. This time with royalist mobs carrying out brutal reprisals against former revolutionaries and Napoleon sympathizers in what became known as the White Terror, a period the restored king struggled to fully control even among his own supporters. Louis XVIII governed for 9 more years and died peacefully in September 1824. The last French king to die while still in power, which tells you almost everything about what came next. Because his successor, his younger brother Charles X, was nothing like him. Where Louis had compromised, Charles provoked. He rolled back press freedoms. He compensated aristocrats for lands seized during the Revolution, funding it with cuts that hit the middle class directly. In July 1830, he went further still, suspending press freedom entirely, dissolving a newly elected parliament before it had even convened, and restricting voting to only the wealthiest landowners. Paris bloated. 3 days of street fighting, barricades across the city, soldiers refusing to fire on civilians. Charles abdicated within days and fled the country for good. And here's a strange footnote worth pausing on, because it closes a loop this story opened a while back. Charles's abdication passed the crown first to his own son, who happened to be married to Marie-Thérèse, the same girl who'd survived the temple as a teenager. For roughly 20 minutes, while her father-in-law's abdication was being signed and her reluctant husband's was still being drawn up, the last surviving child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, technically Queen of France. Then her husband signed too, and it was over. She spent the rest of her life in exile and died in Austria in 1851, having gone from an 8-year-old prisoner in the temple to a queen for 20 minutes to, finally, just an old woman in a small chateau, outliving nearly everyone she'd ever loved. And this is where the story takes its strangest turn yet. Because the now-controlled Paris didn't hand the crown to Charles's grandson, the boy he'd hoped would succeed him. They gave it to a cousin from a completely different branch of the family, Louis Philippe, Duke of Orléans, whose own father, decades earlier, had voted in favor of executing his cousin Louis XVI, and had been guillotined himself for his trouble less than a year later. Now the son of that revolutionary was being handed the throne the revolution had destroyed. Louis Philippe called himself not King of France, but King of the French, a deliberate signal that his authority came from the people, not from God. He walked the streets of Paris without heavy ceremony, reportedly carrying an ordinary umbrella instead of a scepter, and sent his own children to public schools rather than isolating them at court. It was calculated, and for 18 years it mostly worked. But ask yourself what a crown built entirely on popularity is worth the moment that popularity runs out. But the same tensions that had brought down Charles never really went away. A growing industrial working class, stagnant wages, and a king who refused to expand voting rights beyond the wealthy. In February 1848, another uprising broke out, faster and more decisive than 1830 had been. Within days, Louis Philippe abdicated and fled to England in disguise. He died in exile 2 years later. With his flight, the French monarchy, not just his branch of it, but the institution itself, was finished for good. So what actually survived all of this? Not a throne. Just 3 separate bloodlines, each insisting they're still the rightful heirs to a crown that hasn't existed since 1848. The senior line, descended from Charles X, eventually merged into the Spanish royal family. Today its claimant is a man named Luis Alfonso de Bourbon, who goes by Louis XX among his supporters. He's a great-grandson of the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco on his mother's side. He was born in Madrid in 1974, and he currently works in finance. He lives an ordinary professional life, while quietly maintaining a claim to a throne that no longer exists. The Orléanist line, descended from Louis Philippe, has its own claimant, Jean d'Orléans, a former French Army reserve officer who went on to work in finance himself, at firms including Lazard and Deloitte. His supporters call him Jean IV. And there's a third royal house entirely. The Bonapartes, descendants of Napoleon's brother, who maintain their own separate claim to imperial rather than royal authority. Their current head, Jean-Christophe Napoleon, studied at Harvard Business School and built a career in investment banking and private equity in London and New York before founding his own investment firm. 3 countries, 3 competing versions of a crown that France abolished more than 170 years ago. It sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud, and for decades it very nearly stopped being absurd. In 1873, French monarchists came closer to actually restoring the throne than at any point since 1830. The man in line to take it, Henri, Comte de Chambord, refused to rule under France's tricolor flag, insisting instead on the old white Bourbon banner from before the Revolution. He wouldn't bend. The negotiations collapsed. France stayed a republic, and it's been one ever since. The Fifth Republic that governs France today, established in 1958, is about as entrenched as a system of government can get. Nobody seriously expects a French king again. So the real question isn't whether the monarchy is coming back. It's what it means that these families are still here at all, still keeping genealogies, still using titles, still, in a quiet and mostly symbolic way, waiting for a call that almost certainly will never come. Maybe that's the part of this story people underestimate. We tend to think of revolutions as clean breaks. One system ends, a new one begins, and the old order simply stops existing. But power rarely dies that neatly. It gets stripped of land, of armies, of legal authority, and it still doesn't fully disappear. It just shrinks down to something smaller and stranger. A claim, a bloodline. A title nobody outside a small circle takes seriously anymore. Quietly passed from father to son for 200 years, because giving it up entirely feels like admitting the whole thing never mattered. Louis XVI wasn't a monster. Marie Antoinette wasn't the caricature the revolutionary pamphlets turned her into. Their children were innocent by any definition, and all of them were consumed anyway by a system so unequal that the people beneath it eventually stopped caring who personally deserved to pay for it. That's the part of this story that never really goes away. Not the goriest detail, not the palace, not even the crown. It's a child's heart kept in a crystal case for 200 years, finally laid to rest beside parents he barely remembers. It's the most honest monument the revolution ever produced, and nobody planned it that way. If you had to guess out of these three surviving families, the Bourbons, the Orléans, or the Bonapartes, which one do you think France would actually crown, if it ever had to choose? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into the royal family's history left behind, but never quite finished with.